Book of Job, and we're starting the book looking at the purpose of the book, and the book's purpose was to answer an age-old question: is why does God allow the righteous to suffer? But we also pointed out that the better question is how we should suffer, how the righteous should suffer when they're going through trials and afflictions. The book reveals God's confidence in Job. And all through this, you'll see God still has confidence in Job. At the end, he granted Job his opportunity to speak, and then Job confessed that he didn't know what he was talking about. And God said, you better pray for your friends or we're going to have to deal with them. So Job prayed for his friends, and God forgave them. And then Job was blessed twice as much as before. All right, so we also see that in Job, it points a beautiful picture of the coming of Christ. Job knows about his Redeemer. He says, for I know that my Redeemer liveth, and in the latter day he shall set his foot upon the earth. I shall see him face to face. So Job knew about the resurrection, he knew about the Redeemer, and he knew about the end times that were coming. So Job, being one of the early prophets, one of the early men of God, right, close to the time of Abraham, it could have been equal to the time of Abraham, we're not sure, somewhere in that neighborhood, before Moses and all that, long ago, before Moses, ever thought about writing down these books of Genesis through Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, Deuteronomy, before he even thought about that, Job had written this book about his affairs with God. And this is important for us to study this book again, because it gives us answers on how that we should approach tribulation, patience, affliction, how that we should trust in God more rather than less, and how that we need to look to God for answers and watch out for your friends. That's another good lesson in Job. Watch out for your friends. Sometimes they're not your friends at all. But Job also this book defends God's absolute sovereignty. God is in charge of men, all men, not just saved men, but all men. God's in charge of it. God is the sovereign ruler of all creation, and he has the authority to rule and reign over it because he created it. Whenever you create something, let's say, for instance, if Miss Lily was to bake a cake, she creates that cake from scratch, puts it together, assembles it, bakes it, and then does what she has to do to it. Then what can she do with that cake? Whatever she wants. She can eat the whole thing for herself. She could give a small sliver to Ash, or give a big chunk to Aaron, or a small sliver to Candy, and then eat the rest. But it doesn't matter that what she does, it's that she has the right to do what she wishes with that cake. And I know that's a simple analogy, but it's the same thing. I always use the basket analogy. The basket maker made this. It's obvious. It's been made by somebody. And that's the creation too. It's obvious that creation has been made by somebody. And therefore, whoever has made it can do what they will with this basket. And it's the same thing in creation. God made creation, and he can do whatsoever he wills with it, and is doing what he wills. And he is accomplishing his divine plan. Now remember in verse 1 it says, and one that feared God. Job was a man that feared God. Now when you see that word fear in the Bible, and sometimes we can see a different kind of fear. Remember when Nebuchadnezzar's grandson was having a party, and they were using the Lord's vessels in their drunken party, and remember the grandson saw a finger appear and write, Mene, Mene, Tekel Upharsin on the wall. And they couldn't figure out what that was, and he was so scared his knees were knocking, it says. And that's a fear, but it's a physical, emotional fear. The fear that Job has is a fear of not right, a reverential fear, a fear of failure, failing God, and one that springs from the grace of God in his heart. He understands what God has done for him. He understands the love that God has showed him. He understands through all the different chapters we'll look at, he understands what God's plan is. Now, does he have problems? Sure. How many of us don't have problems from the moment we're born till the moment we die? Both lost and saved, we're going to have problems on this earth because of sin. God has made a way for us to be found innocent of sin, to have our sins cleansed from our records, to have our books erased with the blood of the Lord Jesus Christ. But not only does he fear God, but look at, and I like this next phrase, that word, you don't see that too often, eschewed evil. That's not chewed, eschewed. All right? Now what does eschewed mean? Right? To abstain, to avoid, to depart from it. All right? And we use an example often around here. If you see a copperhead laying there in the middle of the aisle, are you going to go right up and give it a good pet or come up and say, oh, what a pretty copperhead. I think I'll take him home for a present. Yep. Most people be climbing the pews and running because we're not a snake handling church, are we? No. So you know that you're to avoid it. You're to depart from it. Get away from it. Leave it alone. And understand that you should hate sin. You should hate evil. You should hate it with a perfect hatred. You should loathe it. You should be indignant at it. Because the fear of God engages you to be so. God hates sin. He hates evil. He loathes it. And he speaks much to this evil that he hates. And Job should be no different. He eschewed evil. He shunned and avoided everything that was evil and whatever gave the appearance of evil. Sometimes you can get in situations where you appear to be doing evil. Like, for instance, if you were to get parked in the ABC parking lot store, what would that give an appearance of? Right, using their buying or getting ready for a party or just whatever. But that would give an appearance of evil. So avoid parking in the ABC parking lot, right? That's how you do that. You avoid it. You don't give people reason to accuse you. Even if it's false, you try not to give them reason. All right, so we need to shun and avoid everything that leads unto evil and that appears to be evil. Now we left off on verse 2, and notice it says, and there was born unto him, that's Job, how many sons? 7 sons, and how many daughters? 3 daughters. All right, so next to his religious character, his graces and spiritual blessings, we also see his children are mentioned, and that children are a blessing from God. Hold your finger here and go over to Psalm 127. Next book over, Psalm 127. And look at verse 3, 4, and 5. Psalm 127, verse 3, 4, and 5. 127, 3, 4, and 5. Lo, look at this, children are an what? Heritage of the Lord. And the fruit of the womb is what? You see, God is granting a reward or a grace or a blessing for children. And it says, as arrows are in the hand of a mighty man, so are the children of the youth. Happy is the man that hath his quiver full of them. Now I could say Job had a quiver full of children. He had 10. Now, nowadays, in this modern society, we often don't see large families, do we? Why? Right, it's too expensive. And we've gotten away from the farm community, and having lots of land to work and things like that. So we've got into this post-computer age now, modern techno age, and it's more likely that you'd have one, if any, children. Matter of fact, the population is way down in America from what it used to be a long time ago. Population has decreased, okay? And people are realizing that it's really expensive to raise a child. And I submit to you that it's hard to raise a child in this spiritual environment that we live in now. So having children sometimes is not a good idea. But God uses children as a blessing, and he does so by, if we look, Job was a man that was upright. He feared God. He served God. He loved God. And God was blessing him both materially and spiritually. Physically, he was allowed to have 7 boys and 3 girls. And those two numbers there are interesting in itself, the number 7 and the number 3. Now think about this, 7 boys. That shows that God had highly favored him and blessed him with children. I can remember families having a dozen around here for a long time. And then, as we said, the more modern we get, the less and less we see families. Now, why did we have such big families in those days?
Like my family were farmers, they needed them to help on the farm.
Right, for help. You know, a mother and father by themselves can do farming, yes, and they may have a good stab at it. But if you have children that can help you do the simple things along the way, you can increase your production. And he has 7 children, 7 boys, and they're grown, and 3 girls, and they're grown. And no doubt that Job had a lot of farm, a lot of pastures, and we'll see why in just a minute or two. But he had a lot of ground that he used for his husbandry, for his farming, for his business, whatever. He had a lot of land and had to have help in dealing with that land. And no doubt each one of these sons would probably be have a specialty in the area that they wanted to work in their daddy's business. And we see that Job had a business because we'll see that in just a minute about all the different animals and all the different things that he had. Now, Job is one of those rare people that can handle riches. You know, what would happen if you had $1 million and put it in your pocket? Well, Lord's honest, ain't you? Be broke in a week. Why? We just don't know how to handle it. Okay? We don't know how to handle it. But Job knew how to handle it. He had, over time, built up. He'd had his family, and he had his boys involved in the work, had given them responsibilities, and they're maturing and profiting in the business as well. And they're being successful in all their endeavors in business. God is blessing that part of them as well. So God can bless your business. God can bless your family. God can bless you all around as long as you're faithful in serving him. And you stop and think about all the blessings that God gives you once you're saved. Think about all those blessings that God gives you. And then look, it says he eschewed evil, and he had 7 sons and 3 daughters. So numerous offspring back then were esteemed as a highly favored thing from God. Remember poor Hannah in the Old Testament? She didn't have no young'uns, and what did she do? Right. Well, no. No, she went to the temple. Remember? Right. And prayed about it. Because his other wife was tormenting her about not having children. So it bothered her. So she sought the Lord, and the Lord answered her prayer. And who came out of that deal? Samuel, the great leader of Israel. All right? So God blesses us with children. All right? But now notice in verse 3, it starts listing his assets. He's got 7 sons and 3 daughters. They're his blessing. He uses them in his business. He uses them in worship and sacrifice, sanctification. So we see God has his family that he's given him. But it says his substance also was 7,000 sheep. Now can you imagine 7,000 sheep? How much pasture would 7,000 sheep take? A whole gob of pasture. Think about that. A whole gob of it. Why? They got to eat, don't they? And you have to have grass for them to graze upon. And they're not the only ones that eat grass. Look here, we've got sheep. And notice what else he has. And he says, and 3,000 camels. What do camels eat? Grass. All right. And 500 yoke of oxen. That's pair. A yoke is a pair of oxen. So that's 1,000 oxes. What do oxes eat? Grass. And 500 she-asses. Donkeys. Okay? What do they eat? Grass. So you stop and think about it. All these animals indicate the largeness of his business opportunities, but also that he was using these facilities and lands that God had blessed him with and using them to create an increase in his wealth. God used it. He allowed it. He helped Job get started. He gave him good land. He gave him good pasture land because he sure needed it, right? 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 oxes, or 1,000 oxes, and 500 she-asses. Okay? That's a whole lot of eating, isn't it? And what else does it take? If you've got all them animals, what else does that take? A lot of help, huh? Right? Servants and children. Kids had to be in on that too. Okay? And servants. Because somebody had to cut the hay to feed them in the winter. Somebody had to plant corn and stuff for their own personal garden to eat, as well as for the animals to eat. You know, I can remember oftentimes back we didn't have no one of those sheller things that you put your corn ear in and it shelled that thing. I remember going like this, you know, to that old corn and getting enough to fill a bucket up and taking it down to the donkeys. Boy, they'd eat that corn up. The cows too, they'd eat it up. Well, that's what each one of them had a different perspective in their businesses. Each one of these sons, and even, I don't doubt, even the 3 sisters also helped him in his businesses. All right? Now I want you to see this. Notice it says 3,000 camels. What are camels known for? Right? Where? Right, in the deserts, in arid climates, they're known for carrying long distance stuff. Camels were the favorite transportation, as it were, for the merchants. Remember that there were camel caravans that spoke of the times there around Arabia, which is close to where Job is, where they would have caravans that would go to the far places, pick up goods, spices, and all those things, and then bring them back and deliver them. And there was a highly sought after spices and ointments and cloth and all those things were brought in, and they would make good money on that. Just like today, if you want to go buy you something, what do you got to do? You got to go to the store. Only in this case, where's the store at? Ain't no store, right? You got to go to the source where it's being made at. So having 3,000 camels was a status symbol as well. Okay? Arabs counted camels as a status symbol. Okay? If you had 10 head of camels, they'd say, oh, you up here. Or 20, or, you know, whatever. It would be a symbol of status that you would be highly esteemed because you had that many camels. All right, now camels can eat a lot too, by the way. So they're creatures that are designed to carry large burdens, and it seems that Job would carry on a commerce and trade it in distant parts, where he would whether he sent the produce of his land and cattle and traffic with them, or simply invested in the trades of the spices and all that. So to have 3,000 camels meant that Job had a good business, because camels would be highly sought after. All right? It says 500 yoke of oxen and 500 she-asses. So what would you use the oxen for? That's what they used for plowing back then. All right? Before they started using donkeys and mules and horses for plowing, they would use oxen. Why would they use oxen, by the way? Why did they start with oxen? They're tough, they're big, and they can plow up hard ground. Now, if you start farming, one of the important things about farming is you have to clear the land, don't you? And those oxen, being stout and full of muscles and heavy enough, they could pull down trees and carry those trees off. They could root up the stumps, and that's the hard part, getting the stump out of the ground. Okay, and they could pull those stumps up out of the ground. So they were very useful in starting that process of creating pasture land, grazing land, and for farming and pulling and all those things that you would need on a farm. So oxes were very important in a farming aspect. They were very important for clearing land and for doing the labor of tilling and sowing the ground. So you had oxen. And then it says she-asses. Now what are she-asses? Why would you say she-asses and not just asses? Why do you think it says she-asses instead of just asses?
Probably just females.
Right, just females, but for the milk. Okay, for the milk. You can milk camels, you can milk these donkeys, you can milk them, you can milk horses. So the thing about that is that they consider that milk that comes from those animals is very rich and very healthy. So you can imagine if you had a little young'un and you didn't have any milk, what would be handy to have around you? Right? Right? A she-ass, a cow, camel, whatever produces milk. Goats, they all produce milk. So that was their chief thing. And they're also used to what? Ride. They use donkeys and things akin to that, mules and all them, for riding purposes, because they were a little bit more gentle than the horses. Horses often were rambunctious. You could get those horses and they'd throw you off and all that, but donkeys were a little more tame. So donkeys would be chosen to ride on, and that was also a status symbol of you riding on the donkey. Remember, what did Jesus ride on when he came into Jerusalem and presented himself to the kingdom? All right, a colt of a donkey, right? So that is a symbol of status, riding a donkey. We speak to one judge, I believe that his sons had 10 donkeys or something like that. So that's another status symbol. So camels, oxes, donkeys, and that, not only that, but it says, and a very great what? All right, so with all of these farms and all this farming, all these businesses, all of these things, it would take a big, big household. I mean big. You remember in the old days when you used to have logging camps where the lumberjacks would go and they had long tables that they would sit at and they'd be served their food before they go out and chop down trees and things like that. They lived there in those big forests and they chopped the trees down and all that. So they camped out there. Well, you can imagine having all of these farms, all of these pastures, all of this livestock to tend to, all of these businesses to take care of, it's going to take huge numbers of servants to help you. And he had those. He said, a very great household. So he had large fields and farms, and it took a lot to keep those things moving smoothly. So Job, no doubt, hired many servants to help him till the land. He had his children that would be the supervisors, and they would be in charge of certain groups of animals or certain groups of farming or whatever. He would assign them tasks, and they would be following under Job. All right? And then it says also, so that this man was the greatest of all the men of the East. What's that mean? Right. He is the most richest, the most powerful, had the most authority and respect and honor, that he was considered to be one of the top dogs around there. He wasn't a king. Right. He feared God. So he wasn't a king, but basically in his status he was. Okay, he wasn't in charge or ruling over people, but he had great honor and esteem from among the people because he was a righteous man. He used his riches wisely. He used them generously. He used them to help people. And he sat in the gate in judgment and did things for people and helped people that had need. So he had many different aspects to his personality that show God's graces in these earthly riches. Now notice, if you get rich, sometimes you go the other direction, though, don't you?
Yeah.
What happens?
Turn away from God.
Right, it pulls you away from God. But in this case, God had blessed him, and Job was able to handle that blessing and still bring honor and glory unto God and live a righteous life. Remember what Jesus said about rich men? How hardly it is for a rich man to enter into the gates of heaven. Remember that? The apostles were scratching their heads at, what? If they don't get in, surely who gets in? Well, Jesus had to change their thinking, didn't he? But God was blessing Job. And Job was living a faithful life. He's living an upright life. And he's living a life pleasing unto God. Because we'll see that down in verse number 7 when God starts a conversation with Satan. We'll see that later on. We haven't got there yet. But we'll see next time we're going to take up where his sons and his daughters start having feasts. Now, this isn't just a drunken revelry. It's not a worldly kind of party as we think of today. These feasts would be more in moderation and designed to celebrate things. For instance, how many of you still get together for your family's birthdays? Right? We get together here at the church, don't we, for birthdays and anniversaries? Well, it would be like that in that sense, where, like, for instance, this guy was born in this month, so they go to his house and celebrate his birthday. Then the next month, or whatever, they would go to theirs and rotate around. And the girls, the women, were invited to join them. The sisters were invited to join them, not for bad parties and all that, but for celebrating the blessings of God. And Job is taking care of that too, making sure that he covers his children in prayer. So look ahead and read about that, what Job does during the days of their feasting, what he's doing. And that shows us that Job had a heart about God. He had a fear of God, and he wanted to make sure his children had a fear of God too. So he sanctifies them, he prays for them, and he even made offerings for them. Now remember, this is before Moses came down with the law, so God had taught them how to do offerings. Remember, Cain and Abel, what were they doing? They were making offerings. They were taught by God to make offerings. All right? So read ahead and see what Job does for his children that help his children to continue on to live good lives. All right? We'll stop there. Let's all stand.